And this is Grace.
Yes, Grace is also here. She's gonna be right there. I think, I noticed, and there was a little bit of a giggle in the final thing for your mother, mild hoarder.
Yes.
So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about sort of where the personal inspiration came from in terms of this story and the notion of exploring hoarding.
Sure, well yes, my mother is I wouldn't call her a hoarder, she's a collector. And my father was also a collector, and when he passed away, he left behind 3 sheds full of stuff, and I was very annoyed with him because we all go through it, but that annoyance led to interest in why, as human beings, do we collect things? Why do we fill up our homes with unnecessary things? Because no other species really does that except for squirrels and bowerbirds, apparently. And I realised, well, actually there must be something more psychological, there must be some deeper reason behind all this. So I went into the psychology of it all and read a lot of literature and watched all those exploitative documentaries, which are horrible. But I discovered that the thing that sort of links a lot of extreme hoarders together is that they have generally suffered a high degree of trauma in some way, and more often than not the loss of a child or a sibling or a twin. And I found that fascinating. So there was sort of that idea, but also at the same time I was going through all my notebooks and journals, and I came across some notes I'd written about a friend of mine who I was going to make a short film about, and she was born with a severe cleft palate. And as a child, she had a lot of operations on her mouth, and at school was bullied and teased a lot, and had a horrific childhood. But then grew up to be quite a well-adjusted, confident, almost extrovert. She really, transformed and overcame all that. So these sort of 2 ideas sort of merged together, and I just started writing, and 16 drafts later in 3 years came up with this.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about sort of throughout that process of those drafts, developing the twins and why you wanted them to be twins, and how you sort of figured out their relationship to one another.
Yeah, well, twins, I've got friends who are twins, and I've always been fascinated by twins, as are scientists, and they're always experimenting on poor twins. But I'm just as interested in the differences between twins as I am about the similarities. And I really wanted them to be male and female because I didn't want them to be ending each other's sentences, but I did want them to be very bonded, and what would happen when they were separated. But Gilbert's very brave, Grace is more fearful. They do have differences. And what I really wanted was that, the audience to think that Gilbert was gone, and that Grace becomes a whole person again, and becomes proactive for the first time in her life. She goes to film school, she makes film, she has a Q&A, but she really becomes a whole person, and she doesn't need Gilbert to necessarily come back and complete her. She realizes that she can be an individual. So then Gilbert coming back is the reward for all the suffering I put her through. And so I am just fascinated with human relationships, but especially twins.
Well, since everyone's seen the movie here, I was wondering if you could actually talk about the happy ending, because and how you sort of structured it, coming to, but while you're putting Grace through some and Gilbert through some really, really awful traumatic stuff. So, tell us a little bit about how you sort of figured that out.
Yeah, well, look, when I write, I try and get a balance between the comedy, the tragedy, the light, the dark. And I always say, if you're not an emotional wreck by the end of one of my films, then I've failed. I really want you to be exhausted emotionally by the end. But I do want you to leave the cinema feeling uplifted, and that there is a happy ending. To this film anyway. My other films tend to have more bleak endings. But it is tricky to write and get that balance right, because I do worry at times that my films are getting too bleak, and so I have to quickly cram in more jokes to balance it out. But look, I think all writers do that. I mean, I think a good story does have dark moments, light moments. I mean, because I'm trying to reflect all our lives. We do go through ups and downs, and that's why I put the roller coaster in there as a sort of symbol of ups and downs. And I know it's also too, because I like films that really wring me out emotionally. My father was an acrobatic clown, a vaudevillian, and he used to say to me, it's really simple with what you're trying to do, Adam. You make them laugh, make them cry. That's it. And I do try and keep it simple when I'm writing, and just remember that. Because yeah, it is tricky. One of my favourite quotes too is that without the dark, the light has no meaning. So you do sort of have to go into those darker moments to have that lightness have more impact.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned you try to keep the script simple, and obviously the animation is anything but. I was wondering, I wanted to ask a little bit about, you know, designing essentially Grace's hoard, and sort of the process of figuring out all the little snail like items, and you know, especially sort of for that opening shot. How long did it take to make all those items? How were you sort of figuring out what they would be?
Well, look, there's times I've wished I'd written a film about a minimalist, because it would have been a lot quicker. Because everything you just saw, every prop, every set, every character was handmade. There's no CGI at all in the film. So even the fire is yellow cellophane, the cigarette smoke is cotton wool, and all the water in the film, all the tears, the oceans and rivers is sexual lubricant. So it's all real stuff. No CGI. But yeah, the hoard was challenging too, because it wasn't just a whole bunch of snail. We really wanted to put a lot of thought into every item, and we had a list on the wall of everyone would come up with snail objects. So the snail band-aid, snail jigsaw puzzles, a snail pregnancy test. There was just, you know, everything we could possibly think of, snail condoms. And it was tricky, and actually we were really worried at one point we weren't even going to have enough hoard, and that would have really ruined the film. So we even got volunteers to come in, and even the camera department made stuff as well. It wasn't very good, it was pretty terrible, but we crammed that in there as well. So yeah, it was a challenge. Yeah.
I was wondering how you thought about the film too, you know, in relation to Australia, and you know, especially as they're pulled apart and you see these different corners of the country. Like, how are you thinking about that in the writing process and the illustrating and animating process?
Sure. Well, look, I've got a cousin who is adopted and was in a foster home for a while, and I remember the trauma he went through. It wasn't a terribly, you know, wonderful experience, and the separation from his original family and the isolation. And Australia is a big place, it's a big continent, but we only have about 30 million people, and most of us live on the coast, so in the middle there's not much. And it takes 5 hours just to get out of Australia on a plane, so that's how big it is. It's bigger than Russia, I don't know, it's enormous. And so it really made sense geographically to have Gilbert and Grace really separated. Of course, if it was set in current times, it would have been much easier. Gilbert could have just flown economy and flown out, you know. But so yeah, back then expensive.
Since we have Grace here, I was wondering if you could, you know, walk us through a little bit about how she works and how she is animated, because we have her here with us. Sure.
Well, she's one of 200 puppets we made, and you know, when I say characters, that includes bees, dogs, insects, you know, anything with a heartbeat is considered a character. 200 sets, and between 5,000 and 7,000 props were all handmade. And yes, she's a mixture of clay, baked clay, silicone, and she's probably only worth about $10 in materials, but the hours that have gone into her, she's probably worth over $10,000. So she's a very complex little puppet. Her arms are magnetic, they come off like that. Her arms are silicone, they've got little armatures in them. Her eyeballs are magnetic, and her little black pupils are little tiny high-powered magnets that I can move around just with my finger. she had a tray of eyelids. So every time she had to blink every 11 seconds. So every character had a little tray of eyelids. We put them in those little pill boxes you get at the pharmacy. You know. And her mouths, so in the film there's over 1,000 plasticine mouths. Pinky alone, I think 100 mouths. Grace had probably 20 or so. And so every time, if she says hello, that's probably 6 mouths that we have to take on and off. They're 25 frames per second, or 24 for film. So in the film there's over 130,000 individual movements. And it took 33 weeks to shoot, 7 animators doing between 5 and 10 seconds per day. So yeah, it's very slow. That's why it cost $4.7 million.
Was there, I mean, you know, it is obviously a very slow process. Was there a sequence that was, you know, the most sort of joyful to animate, that you sort of knew that it had like an element of fun to it?
Yeah, look, there were certainly, you know, animators, I give them a bit of freedom when they animate. So even though it's a very prescribed art form, we have a storyboard and every animator is told what they have to do. I do let them invent their own things, and some of the animators are much better with comedy, some are better with poignancy. Actually, my producer Liz, who's just over there, stand up Liz, I always make her stand up because she never gets credit. Liz's partner Pierce was one of the 7 animators, and he would always add something new to a shot. So I think there's that shot of Pinky lying on her back in the Dead Sea, where there's a little old man sort of near her looking at her. Well, at the end of that shot, he had the little old man bend down and his bottom popped up naked, and we had to cut that out, sadly. So there's a lot of outtakes that never made it in. But yeah, I would always say to the animators, bring something new. If you can think of something new, add to it. And the thing too, the difference between computer animation and stop motion is that we have what Bob Ross calls happy accidents. So, you know, the character would come on screen and then suddenly an ear would drop off, and the animator would have to, I'll either start again, abandon the shot, or I keep going. And often we'd say, keep going, do something. So the character would suddenly scratch their head or something, you know, anything to sort of rescue the shot. But sometimes it would lead to something that was funnier, and you just don't get that in CGI. I mean, you know, a lot of friends of mine are CGI animators and they do wonderful things, but stop motion has this added magical sort of quality, because really we are magicians more than we are filmmakers. We're trying to get you to believe that these little blobs of clay are alive, have a soul, a heartbeat, and we have to get you to suspend your disbelief for an hour and a half.
Is that one of the reasons you made Gilbert a magician?
Yeah. I like playing around with the metaverse, and you know, Christopher Nolan obviously with Inception, and in this film I wanted Grace to be a stop motion animator, and so I loved all that. I love playing around with those ideas, and actually I've given up animating because I'm not very good at it. But the thing, I did do one shot in this film, it's my Hitchcock moment. I animated Grace animating the snail, and it took me 8 takes. It was that bad. I finally got there.
Well, we have some time for some audience questions, if anyone has one. Well, I see right in the front there. Hand one up.
Were you like ever inspired by Wes Anderson? Because I kind of see a little bit of Wes Anderson.
Yeah.
In this movie, except it's a little more bleak and.
Bleaker than Wes Anderson, yeah. Well, no, certainly Wes Anderson, Guillermo del Toro. You know, even their live action films. I mean, of course, they're both stop motion, but there's all sorts of influences. You know, I look at my stuff and I see a lot of Sesame Street. I was brought up at Sesame Street back in the 70s on black and white TV. There wasn't colour, hadn't been invented then. So Sesame Street, there's so many influences on my work, and the hard thing is, as an artist, is to try and come up with something original and unique. And so I've spent many years trying to get my eyeballs to be original, and mine are egg shaped. So Aardman do, you know, Wallace and Gromit have the perfect spheres. Mine are like eggs. So, you know, and I always say to emerging artists, spend as much time as you can coming up with a style and an aesthetic that's yours, that's your, you know, and that's the thing with my films, that people know immediately when they see them that they're mine. But yeah, absolutely, all sorts of influences. Yeah.
Okay, where do I see? I see you over there. I'll get to
Learning
that.
what you did from this, are there any changes to your approach to filmmaking we should expect in future projects?
Yeah, any changes with future prospects? Absolutely. Every film I try and push myself, not just in terms of the story, but the aesthetic. My next film, I want it to be a road film, because I think the audience, you're probably all a bit sick of my characters being stuck in their bedrooms in suburbia. I want to break free. I want to do a Thelma and Louise road film sort of in Australia. But yeah, this film I abandoned fabric. This is the first film where I don't use fabric at all. So the characters, all their costumes are painted on. I really wanted to go back to a much more organic look, much more rough and ready. And we use two words in our art department, chunky wonky. So everything has to look asymmetrical. One of the, several of the prop makers actually, when they started, were making things that were too good, and I would say, can you make it worse? Can you drop it on the ground? Can you put some dints into it because it's looking too refined? We want it to look a bit sloppy and rough around the edges, because I think the characters themselves are imperfect, so we want the aesthetic to be imperfect as well.
Okay, somewhere in the middle back there. There are many faces, right in the center there. The front row, the farthest front row, you. Yeah, you. Sorry.
I was curious about the intention of the characters that were gray. I read them as black or indigenous, but was curious why they weren't just brown.
Yeah, with the colour palette, we really wanted to, well, the tricky thing is with the film, I banned certain colours. So there's no blue and there's no green, because my mother used to dress me up in blue as a child. But with the skin tones, we were limited by, what do we have? We have black, grey, brown, cream, and the tricky thing is to colour match. So for example, when we came up with the plasticine mouth, we'd have to then go and colour match the paint, and then we'd have to colour match the silicone arms. So you have to sort of do a triple whammy to get everything uniform. But yeah, the films are, we of course looking to get as much diversity as possible too. It's behind. One of the voices in the film, because I love non-actors too, one of my friends, Bernie Clifford, is the voice of Owen, the minister, and he's got this great voice like that. And so we got him, and Bernie was in my last film too. Bernie was hit by a bus and has one leg, and he has been in a couple of my films now. And also too, we struggled to really get a balance between, in the animation department, it's so hard to find female stop motion animators. There's a lot of younger ones coming up through, but it's been traditionally a very male dominated, particularly in Australia. It's just hard enough to find any stop motion animators in Australia. But we have, all our funding is through the government too, so we have now a lot of mandates to get diversity, gender balance, and we've got a great gender balance in the art department, all these fantastic female set builders. But yeah, it's also interesting too, a lot of the animators are on the spectrum, and my last film, Marion Axe, was about my pen pal who identified as an Aspie, and he passed away a few months ago, and sadly I never got to meet him properly. I met him 10 years ago. But a lot of our animators are on the spectrum, and that's actually really handy because they have fantastic work ethics. There's this obsessive, it's a lonely thing being a stop motion animator. You're in the dark a lot by yourself, moving things around. You do need incredible patience. Although it's not tedious, I get that a lot. Even my accountant a few years ago said, "Gee, Adam, what you do must be tedious." I said, "You're an accountant." So anyway, I've forgotten your question, but yeah, went off on a rant there.
Okay, right there on the side.
In many of the scenes, including this production still right here, the twins either together or by themselves are reading either classical literature or not so classical literature. Was that intentional in terms of sort of opening a door into their lives, even though they seemed isolated in their own homes in suburbia, and yet they had this escape valve, which was literature? Was that intentional?
Yes, so for me it was important that they read, because reading, of course, is an escape, and because they're a poor family, the father, Percy, instills in them the importance of reading. And a lot of those novels are, of course, some of the novels I read as a child or were forced to read at school. So I wanted there to be a connection with literature, but I also then wanted Grace to go into bad literature and go into, trashy novels, romance novels, but then come back. So what's the final one she reads?
I think she's reading the Diary of Anne Frank.
The Diary of Anne Frank, and then Gilbert's the one reading the ginger-chested pirate. So yeah, it just was a little layer in there that I wanted, that books were this escape from their depression and misery and whatever, all the way through their life.
We have time for one more question. I see over there in the back. There are two people. Yeah, you can go. You pointed to her.
How immediately did you find the snail as your animal? What source for that?
Oh, so why snails? Yeah, well look, originally the story was, the first draft was Memoir of a Ladybird, but then that film Ladybird came out. And Liz and I were looking for different creatures and animals. We wanted something that was much more metaphorical and symbolic, and we thought of pigs and ducks and frogs and all the other things that people collect, but I can't remember exactly why, when I came up with snails, but it just, when I thought more deeply about snails, I thought, well, actually, they're a good metaphor for Grace's life, because you touch a snail's antennas and they retract into their shell, and that's what Grace is doing her whole life, is she's retracting from the world, and she's using her hoard as a shield. So there was that, but also, I love the swirl on a snail's shell, I can never say it, the Fibonacci spiral, there's a scientific word. That's it, the Fibonacci spiral. And I thought that'd be a really nice motif to have through the film, because even that is sort of symbolic of life going full circle. And also too, I discovered that snails can't reverse, they can only go forwards. And I thought, well, actually that ties into my favourite quote, that life can only be understood backwards but delivered forwards, which is by the philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. And I like that had a little link as well. So it's just finding all these connections, and also they're just so alien, and they're not pretty. Well, I think they're pretty, but they're just, and also that links to that Aesop's fables, the tortoise and the hare, slow and steady wins the race. There's all these little things, so it just felt right.
Well, that's a perfect way to end, and we unfortunately have to. Thank you so much, Adam, for being here. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you for coming. Yeah. Tell all your friends.